I'd like to thank Cub Crafters for sponsoring Tailwheel 101 and also for building such a fine aircraft. I'd also like to thank Alaskan Bushwheel. They build one fantastic tire. It's durable and saves your airframe a tremendous amount of pounding. Whether you're flying in the bush or a farmer's pasture, I'd go with Alaskan Bushwheels. Hi, my name is Damian Delgazo, and I'll be your instructor for Tailwheel 101. The following procedures and techniques are the ones that work for me in the aircraft that I fly. They may not work for every pilot in every airplane in every situation. Always make sure you follow your pilot's operating handbook and the manufacturer's recommended procedures for any airplane that you fly. And please always make sure you receive competent instruction by a qualified instructor before you attempt anything on this film. Let's get started with the ground school. Our student for the next few days will be Jill, and she's going to be getting her tailwheel endorsement with us. First thing we're going to talk about are some of the handling differences between the tailwheel versus the tri-gear. A lot of this has to do with the placement of the center of gravity compared to its landing gear or its pivot point. If you take a look at the board here, you'll see that by this illustration, the airplane's main landing gear is its pivot point. And on a tailwheel airplane, it's right here, and we'll just draw that line through like that. And its center of gravity is behind its pivot point. If we take a look at a tricycle gear airplane, here's its pivot point. Its center of gravity is ahead of its pivot point. Because of this difference between the center of gravity and the airplane's pivot point, the ground handling is going to be different, and we need to handle the rudders differently. If you take a look at this illustration here of the tricycle gear airplane, you can see that its center of gravity is ahead of its main wheels, and there's your nose wheel. If we take this airplane and let's say that we're crabbed on the touchdown, meaning our nose is pointing off to the right, and we make ground contact, the forces that are acting on the center of gravity, which will be basically parallel to its direction of travel, these forces are going to have a tendency to pull the center of gravity, in this case, to the left, or straighten the airplane out. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at the example of the tailwheel airplane. Again, here's our pivot point, main landing gear. Center of gravity is behind the pivot, okay? If we take this airplane and we put it in the same scenario where we are making ground contact in a crab, let's say, again, our nose is pointing off in this direction. Our direction of motion, which is again parallel to the runway, is going to be acting on our center of gravity. In this illustration, you can see that what's going to happen is it's going to have a tendency to start to pull the tail around or move the nose away from our direction of travel, in other words, to the right. Okay, the problem with this is there's nothing here that's self-correcting. This is actually self-feeding. So as that tail begins to swing, it's going to start to pick up momentum, and it just wants to keep spinning all the way around, which would be known as a ground loop. Does that make sense to you, Jill? Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we do a little illustration with the model here. We'll use these little bits of tubing to simulate the ground track of the airplane. Again, this will represent our pivot point, our main landing gear, and here's our center of gravity, which is behind that. All right. So let's say that as we're coming in for a landing, we're in a bit of a crab, maybe there's a crosswind, and the airplane makes ground contact in that crabbed configuration. As we make ground contact, you can see that we're going to side load this left tire. And when that happens, the direction of motion, which is still basically parallel the runway, is going to have a tendency to pull that center of gravity and pull that tail around with it. As the tail starts to swing, it picks up momentum, and it just wants to swing all the way around, which would be the ground loop, okay? There exists in every airplane a point of no return, where the airplane will ground loop pretty much no matter what you do. And just to keep things simple, that point of no return will be if we allow the center of gravity to get outside the ground track of the main wheels. So if we allow this nose to swing, you can see here that the center of gravity, which is back here, is getting outside the ground track of the main wheels. Once that happens, it's going to go, and it'll go all the way around. So we have to make sure that we never allow that center of gravity to get outside the ground track of the main wheels. If you take a look at it, it's really a fair amount of leeway. By the time this center of gravity actually gets outside the ground track, that's a good 35 or 40 degrees. Now that'll change with different airplanes. The more narrow the ground track, the less leeway you're going to have as far as the ground looping goes. So the wider the ground track on the main gear, the easier the plane is going to be to manage.
Okay.
The ground loop doesn't just happen for no reason at all. There's always a triggering mechanism, and generally that's caused by, it's a swerve. And the swerve can be caused by any number of things. The airplane is a perfect weather vane. If you take a look at the example we have here, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of surface area behind the airplane's pivot point. Okay, in this example, we have a tailwheel airplane, a weather vane, say on the roof of a house, and a tricycle gear airplane. You can see that a weather vane on the roof of the house or a barn, there's a lot more surface area behind the pivot than there is in front of. So when the wind blows, this will have a tendency to turn into the wind because there's more surface area behind its pivot. The tailwheel airplane is pretty much the same thing. You have a lot more surface area behind its pivot point, so it's very susceptible to weather vaning. The tri-gear airplane, although there is more surface area behind its pivot point, it's not nearly as drastic as the tailwheel or the weather vane. There's any number of things that can cause the swerve. The bottom line is you need to pay a lot more attention to directional control than you would with a tri-gear airplane. Let's just say that the airplane does begin to swerve, and you can see that that center of gravity is approaching the point of no return. In other words, it's starting to get outside the ground track of the main wheels. There's some things that we can do here to try to minimize the ground loop or stop it from happening. I like to do the things that are going to be the most natural, and in this case, the first and most natural thing would be to add some left rudder. By bringing in the left rudder, you're going to get some rudder effectiveness if you have any kind of prop blast or speed or airflow across the rudder. And also some tail wheel steering. The next best thing is to bring in that left brake. The left brake will add drag to this wheel and start to pivot the center of gravity back. So in order of importance, I would use rudder and then brake, and those are probably the two most effective tools against the ground loop. The other things that you can do would be power. Adding power can put prop blast across the rudder, and that may help blow the tail around. The thing about the power is it's kind of a double-edged sword. If it's too much power, then the airplane's going to accelerate, and if you're pointing at the fuel truck, that's not a good thing to have happen. So if you're going to use the power, you want to use it in short but powerful bursts of power. Just kind of pop it, pop it, pop it. This way you're energizing that rudder, but you're not really allowing the airplane to gain an appreciable amount of speed. Last but not least is the aileron. If the airplane is, in this case, swerving to the right, what you would do is bring your aileron into the swerve. In other words, bring it hard over to the right. As the airplane starts to come around, what's going to happen is, remember, it's trying to move in this direction, basically. It will kind of tip. Its center of gravity is higher. It's going to have a tendency to tip this way or to the outside of the turn. By bringing the aileron hard over to the right, it's going to drop this aileron. And what will happen is it may stop the wing from banging on the ground. The other thing is you may get some adverse yaw from that, which may help pivot it back. At slow speeds, in my opinion, the ailerons are not going to do a whole lot for you. So that's last on my list of importance, okay? So for me, it's going to be rudder, brake, throttle, then ailerons. Okay, we have a little bit of video clip here, so why don't we take a look at that. Okay, what we've done here is we stage a ground loop in our Stearman at a very slow speed and a safe speed so it wouldn't damage the airplane. And as you can see, what we have is a swerve to the right followed by an overcorrection to the left. So the swerve is a triggering mechanism which leads to the ground loop. This line represents the direction of motion or the forces that are acting on the center of gravity. the center of gravity will always attempt to travel in that direction. As the airplane is allowed to swerve to the left, the center of gravity will begin to pull the nose further to the left as it continues down this line. The tail in turn will swing right, building momentum as it does. Once that center of gravity gets outside the track of the main gear, you're going for a ride. Before you get to the point of no return, you have a small window of opportunity to prevent or minimize the ground loop. That would be timely application of opposite rudder and corresponding brake, in this case, right rudder and right brake, short but powerful bursts of power, and aileron into the swerve. That all seemed pretty scary, didn't it? It's not nearly as bad as it seems. But you can tell there are some differences because of that center of gravity placement behind the airplane's pivot point. And because of that, you do have to treat the rudders differently in a tail wheel than you do in a tri-gear. So you just want to have a different mindset. You can treat a tri-gear like a tail wheel, but you can't treat the tail wheel like a tri-gear. A drill that I like to do is to take a stick, which I happen to have right here, and I like to balance it on 2 fingers. And this will kind of illustrate the way you're going to handle the rudders. If I want to balance that stick on 2 fingers, you can see that I can make many small corrections, and I can balance that stick and keep it in a pretty small area, okay? This is really the same as a tailwheel airplane, okay? Here's my pivot point, my center of gravity, or my weight mass is back here. I'm just doing it in a vertical plane. And I make a lot of small inputs, input, neutralize, input, neutralize, input, neutralize. You can see I'm not flailing the rudders, I'm not moving them wildly, see? I'm just kind of input, neutralize, and I'm kind of watching that tip just to keep it balanced, okay? Okay, why don't you try it?
Okay.
I'll just step out of the shot here, put my crash helmet on. That's it. Lots of small corrections. Avoid making the large corrections.
Oh.
Okay, that was very good, Jill, for your first time. Why don't you go ahead and sit down? The reason I do that is so that your brain makes a connection with your hand and then hopefully later with your feet, because it's a very similar type of input. Some of the common mistakes are over-controlling. In other words, making the inputs way too large, which sets up a series of swerves, and you can see each one gets worse until you actually lose it. And the other is making an input and then waiting to see where the nose is going to go, and that's pretty much what you do in a tri-gear. You make an input, you let the nose go where it wants, and you just get off the rudder. In this case, you can't let it go that far because that tail is going to pick up momentum. So what you want to avoid is making an input, waiting to see where it goes, and then trying to chase it back the other way. It creates a series of swerves, and eventually it'll get too large, and the airplane will ground loop.
Okay.
We taxi the airplane much like you do in a tri-gear. You just move your rudder pedals to steer left or right, and that's accomplished through the use of a tail wheel. And we have a tail wheel down here. When you move the rudder, there's an arm on the bottom of the rudder, which looks a lot like this arm, steering arm here, and through a series of chains and springs, it's connected to this arm. So when we move the rudder left or right, it steers your tail wheel. Most tail wheel airplanes are of this type, and there's a clutching mechanism here that allows this to break free or kick out. The reason they do that is so that you can make very tight turns on the ground. Okay? The only problem is once this kicks out, it's no longer steerable. Okay? To get it steerable again, you have to use differential brakes to bring this back to center, and now you have steering again. So your tail wheel steering on the ground is good for about 35 to 40 degrees, and then this will probably kick out, which coincidentally is just about the time you need it most on the ground loop. So don't let that nose swing beyond that 30-degree point. Okay, so we'll talk about taxiing in general. When we start the airplane up, you always want the stick back and the brakes on, because on the startup, if your stick is forward and the throttle's set too high, then it might raise the tail. We don't want that to happen, okay? Once the airplane's rolling, we need to make any turns. We bring in the rudder first. If you need to use brakes, don't lock the brakes. It's bad technique, and you'll end up having to use more power. Just drag the brake. Just apply a little pressure, put some drag on the inside wheel, and keep that inside tire always spinning so you don't flat spot your tires, okay? So when we taxi the airplane, depending on the machine, it may be blind or partially blind, meaning you might not be able to see anything over the nose like in the Stearman, and or you may be able to see everything over the nose. If it's a partially blind airplane, or if it's very blind, then you're going to have to do some S-turns just to see what's out in front of you. And you can see by this illustration here, this airplane is S-ing left and right. Okay? If you S-turn to the right, you look out the left side. You S-turn to the left, you look out the right side. When you do your S's, try not to make the S's too large. In other words, what you need to be aware of is where your tail is all the time. If the S-turn is too large, then when you swing back, you may swing your tail off the taxiway. When you come up to the end, especially if it's a sharp turn, don't stop on the center line to do your run-up because you may not have room for that tail to swing around the outside of the turn. Rather, cut to the inside of the turn, stop here, you can do your run-up there, and then you'll have more room for that tail to swing around that outside of the turn. It's also very important that when you taxi, that you hold the controls properly. We talked about the weather vaning tendency of the airplane. Proper control placement is pretty much the way it is with a tri-gear airplane. If we had a quartering headwind in this case, you'd want to have the stick back because that's going to help hold the tail on the ground, which we want to do. And you want to turn your ailerons into the wind. So stick back, ailerons into the wind, or stick into the wind. So if you have a headwind, climb into it, stick back, aileron into the wind. If you had a tailwind, quartering, let's say, then you want your stick forward and in the same direction the wind is blowing. So in this case, it would be forward and left. Climb into a headwind, dive away from the tailwind. The reason you want the stick forward with a tailwind is so that that wind striking the elevator helps hold the tail down. If you're taxiing into the wind, then you want to stick back for the same reason. The wind striking the elevator helps hold the tail down. You always want to be aware of where your throttle is compared to your stick, okay, regardless of what the wind's doing. If you're carrying lots of RPM, then you're going to want that stick back all the time. If your stick is forward and you start bringing your power up, you run the risk of raising the tail. So you always want to have an awareness of where's my throttle set compared to where my stick is, okay? An example of that would be, let's say we're taxiing in snow or mud. Well, it may take a lot of RPM. It might take 2,000 RPM just to move the airplane. Well, with that kind of RPM, if your stick is forward, you are likely to raise the tail. So in that case, I'd want the stick back. So in general, way to think about it is, if my prop blast is greater than the tailwind component, then you want to have the stick back, okay? As we pull out onto the runway, the center line is going to become less and less important for us, especially if you're in an airplane that's blind, because simply you can't see the center line. So as you're pulling out onto the runway, right here you'll be able to see the center line pretty well, and if you look at this illustration, you can see the center line offset. But as you start to taxi in line with the center line is going to go away. If you look at this illustration here, you can see that we can't see the center line at all, okay? However, what you can see are the runway edges, and really this is what's going to become very important for you, is runway edges are everything, and the center line really doesn't come into play for us anymore. So we are looking for here is the runway edges. If you have equal distance between the edges, then you're centered, and if the lines are straight, then you're straight. Okay, so that's what you're looking for. These become your reference points now for whether the airplane is tracking straight and that we're centered. Okay, so why don't we go out and we'll practice some taxiing and some fast taxis.
All right.
All right, Jill, before we even crank the engine up here, time for a little pop quiz. Before we even taxi, we'll talk about how to hold the controls if the wind is blowing. Let's assume that right now you had a headwind while you were taxiing. How would you hold that stick?
Hold it back.
Right, and you're holding it back because you want to keep the tail on the ground, right? Let's say that it was not a direct headwind, let's say it was a quartering headwind from the right. Where would you put the stick then?
Back and to the right.
Right. Easy way to remember that is climb into the wind. If it's a quartering headwind, climb into it. So stick would be back and into the wind. This places the controls in a position so you're holding the tail down and not allowing the wind to get underneath the wing. Let's say that we're taxiing with a tailwind or we're taxiing downwind. Where would you put the stick?
Forward.
Correct. Your stick would be forward for the same reason. The wind striking the down elevator would actually hold the tail down. How about if it was a quartering tailwind from the right?
I would go forward and
to the left, right? So an easy way to remember that is with the tailwind, dive away from the wind. So stick forward and in the same direction the wind is blowing, okay? Of course, there's always exceptions to that rule. You always want to be conscious of what you're doing with the power. Anytime you're carrying lots of power while you're taxiing or even trying to pivot a turn, you always want to be aware of what you're doing with that stick. If you have the stick forward and you add a lot of power, you run the risk of lifting the tail off the ground, which of course can be dangerous. Another thing you can do is when you pivot a turn, in many circumstances you can use some forward stick to help pivot a turn. The forward stick will lighten the load on the tail wheel, provided you're not carrying too much power, of course. And what that does is allow the steering springs to pull that tail wheel tire over a little bit tighter, and you'll actually get a tighter turn. Also, a little bit of forward movement is always desirable. You never want to start to pivot a turn from a dead stop. You always want to get the airplane moving first, and then apply the rudder, and then some light braking, and then perhaps some forward stick to help pivot the turn. If you get the plane moving forward first, that little bit of momentum will help carry the tail through the turn. It's almost like doing a baby ground loop in a way, because your center of gravity is behind the pivot point. If you get it moving first, you can use that forward momentum to help carry that center of gravity through the turn, or carry the tail through the turn. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions?
Nope, I think I have it.
Okay, let's get started.
All right, Jill, now that our pre-flight is done, what we're going to do is go through the startup procedure. Anytime that you start up a tailwheel airplane, you want to make sure that you hold the stick back. Go ahead and do that. And you hold the brakes. And the reason you want the stick back is so that if we start the airplane up and we have our throttle set too high, or we're not paying attention to it, it'll hold the tail down. So the idea is to keep the tail down during the engine start. So you always want that stick back during the engine start. The brakes on so the plane doesn't lurch forward. Okay, let's get her primed up here. Our stick back and our brakes are on. Master switch is on. Our mixture is rich. Basically 3 M's, mixtures, masters, and now turn the mags on both. Clear. Okay, now what we're going to do is demonstrate the improper way to taxi, or to pivot a turn, I should say. And this is a common mistake that people make, where they just basically lock a brake and try to get the airplane to turn. And it's just not good for the tires, and it takes way too much power to make it happen. What we don't want to do is try to taxi the airplane with that brake locked to try to pivot the turn, because all it's going to do is wear a flat spot on the tire and take a lot more power to move the airplane. Not good for the airplane or the tires. The other thing is, when you're carrying that much power, let's say we had a little forward stick in to try to pivot the turn, it could actually cause the tail to come up off the ground like that, which is obviously not a good thing. A better way to taxi the airplane is to always get the airplane rolling first, and then just drag a brake to pivot the turn. And then if you're not carrying a lot of power, a little bit of forward stick, unload the tail wheel a little bit and give us a little bit better tail wheel steering. Okay, so if I want to pivot a turn from a dead stop, let's say, I get the airplane rolling first, then I just simply add the rudder, a little bit of forward stick, and maybe drag the brake, but I'm not locking the brake. Sometimes it's helpful to pump the brake a little bit, where you're just kind of, you get it to go tighter just by kind of pulsing the brake. Really just come around, but I'm not going to get a flat spot by doing that.
Well, Jill, you did pretty well with the Top Cub. What do you say we kick it up a notch and try something a little bit tougher, like the Stearman right here?
I'm gonna fly that.
Well, we're going to taxi it first. You game for it?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Clear.
Okay, the whole purpose of the S-turns is simply so you can see. So you won't be able to see the center line. So what we're going to do is do S's. We're going to carve some S's just to see what's out in front of us.
Okay.
When I S to the left, you're going to look out the right side. And when I S to the right, you're going to look out the left side. You also want to make the S's big enough so that you can see. And avoid making the S's too large, because your tail may swing off the taxiway. That's it. Look out the left side. Look out the right side. Good. Now as you come up to the end of the taxiway, you have to decide where to stop. And if you're in an airplane that carves a large arc like this airplane does, then you want to stop to the inside of the turn so your tail will have room to swing around the outside. If there's enough room, you can stop and turn the airplane into the wind if there's a cul-de-sac, but sometimes you just can't do that.
Okay.
Coming up to the end, a little bit of brake. And that's good. Okay, Jill, what do you say we go for a ride?
Sounds good.
What we're going to do here, Jill, is set up a fast taxi, and this will simulate a takeoff and a landing roll. And what we're going to do is just gain some speed, and I want you to just use those rudders nice and easy, lots of small changes, small inputs to keep the airplane tracking straight. It's a lot like that drill I gave you where you had to balance a broomstick on 2 fingers. Just keep trying to make small inputs and then neutralizing those inputs. You're watching the edges of the runway through the propeller arc, and the edges are going to tell you that you're keeping the airplane straight. Does that make sense to you?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, there's 2 things you want to pay particular attention to. One, keep your heels on the floor. The other is, as we gain speed, those rudder inputs are going to become much more sensitive. So the faster the airplane goes, you have more airflow across the rudder, the smaller the inputs are going to become. The reverse is true as we decelerate. So when we throttle back and the airplane starts to slow down, pay particular attention to the rudder fade. There's going to be a rudder fade around 20 miles an hour, where all of a sudden those inputs on the rudders have to become somewhat larger. You really need to tune into that. You know, coming off of a tri-gear airplane, you're not used to that. You're used to just kind of landing and relaxing. And in a tailwheel, your workload actually starts to increase as you decelerate somewhat. So as the airplane slows down, focus more attention on those rudders, and the inputs will become somewhat larger.
Okay.
Okay, ready to give it a whirl?
I'm ready.
This time we're going to do a fast taxi. We're going to try to move the plane from center, just right of center, and then back to center. And we're not going to try to make that turn in one big arc because that'll set up a swerve that'll be kind of hard to handle. So we're just going to take little bites, little bite to the right, square it off with the outside rudder, initiate with the inside rudder, square it off with the outside rudder. Little bite, little bite, little bite. And so we're just going to take little tiny turns and then square them off just to move the airplane. We're going to step it over little bites at a time. We're going to do that right and left. And if you can do that, you'll have no problem tracking the airplane straight. All right, here we go. Okay, right of center, little bite, and square it off. Another little bite, and square it off. Another little bite, and square it off. Another little bite, and square it off. Now we're going to go back to the left. Small bite, square it off. Small bite, square it off. Small bite, square it off. Focus on the rudder. As the airplane starts to slow down, you can feel that fade in the rudder. The inputs become larger as we go slower. All right, good.
Okay, Jill, you did great with the fast taxis. Let's talk about takeoffs a little bit. You already know that you're going to transition from a 3-point attitude to a 2-point attitude, accelerate, and then get airborne. There's some things that we need to discuss here, specifically some of the left turning tendencies. You already know about the left turning tendencies with a tri-gear airplane. The one that we're going to have to chat about a little bit is the gyroscopic force that comes off the propeller, because you don't get this with a tri-gear during the takeoff segment, and you do with a tailwheel airplane. If you raise the tail too abruptly or too quickly, you can get a gyroscopic force off the propeller, which will cause a left swerve. And it can be significant in some airplanes, especially if you fly an airplane with a higher horsepower, a bigger propeller. I just happen to have a gyroscope down here, so I'll demonstrate this. Let's just say that we get this spinning the way that I see the propeller, which is clockwise from inside the cockpit. This represents the nose being high, and let's say I'm going to raise the tail. If I push that very abruptly, if I raise the tail too quickly, you can see that swerve's pretty good to the left. And the more abruptly I do that, the harder the swerve. If I raise the tail slowly, you can see that that is minimized. So if I do it abruptly, it's pretty hard over. If I do it slowly, it's minimized, okay? The gyroscopic force will be directly proportional to the abruptness or the speed at which you raise that tail. If I'm very abrupt raising the tail, then that swerve is going to be abrupt as well, okay? So why don't you try it? That's it. And just get that spinning clockwise. And just kind of raise that tail real harsh. Just feel that pull off to the left. All right, now do it again.
Yeah.
All right, now do it nice and slow. Now nice and easy. See how that's minimized? Okay. So you can see that the more slowly I raise that tail, the less gyroscopic force will be. Okay. All right, great. Okay, there's basically two ways to accomplish the takeoff. One will be letting the tail fly itself up, and the other will be helping the tail up. For low time tailwheel pilot, I prefer to just let the tail kind of fly itself up. And the way you do that is you start with the stick back, you taxi into position, make sure your tail wheel's straight, give the throttle a 5 count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The slower you count on the throttle, the better it is for the engine. And also you're kind of metering those left turning tendencies. So the slower you add power, the easier it is to keep up with the rudder work. Once you get to full power, just simply relax the stick. Don't pull it, don't push it, just relax the stick. What will happen is, as the airplane gains forward speed, the elevator will streamline itself to the horizontal stabilizer, and the tail will go to wherever your trim is set. So if your trim is set for neutral, the tail is going to fly itself up to level. The reason I like this technique is because it really allows you to focus on your directional control on your rudders. You're really not having to think so much about what you're doing with the stick, it's just what you're going to do with the rudders. And initially, that's a good way to go. The downside to this is that it'll take a little bit longer for that to happen. You're going to eat up a little bit more runway, and you may limit your visibility over the nose somewhat. But if I'm using the edges of the runway to keep my airplane straight, then I'm really not all that concerned about the forward visibility, as long as I can keep the airplane tracking straight. The other nice thing about this is it'll telegraph to you when the airplane's ready to fly, because in order of flight, your tail will fly first, the wings will fly behind that. So if I let the tail fly itself up, about the time that happens, it's a good time to test the water with a little back stick, and the plane will just fly itself off the ground. Once you get some tail wheel savvy, and you want to get to the point where you're helping the tail up, the way we're going to do that is actually quite similar. You're going to taxi position, stick back, 5 count on the throttle, relax the stick. The tail's still going to start to get light all on its own because it's going to streamline itself to the horizontal stabilizer just like it did before. The only difference will be is as you feel that tail starting to get light, you're just going to get behind it and help that tail up a little bit. There'll be a point there after you relax the stick where you'll feel like if I just push the stick another 1/4 to 1/3 forward, that tail would come up, and that's a good time to raise the tail. This way you're not trying to force it up too quickly or abruptly. The one thing you want to watch for is that you never get the tail up before you have enough rudder authority to offset the left turning tendencies. Does that all make sense to you, Jill?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the landings. What we've done here is we've broken this down into the approach, the glide brake, and then the flare, okay? The approach will be pretty conventional, pretty much the way it was in a 150. You're going to use the end of the runway to judge your glide path. Once you get to the level off, then it becomes a little bit more critical that you do this properly. The tri-gear will let you get away with a lot more than the tail wheel will. What I really mean by that is if you break your glide too low to the ground and your main wheels make ground contact first, you run the risk of the airplane getting airborne again. And this has to do with the center of gravity placement, again, behind the main wheels or our pivot point. And what I mean by that is if we break our glide too low, in other words, the gap between you and the ground is too small, as the airplane's losing speed and you start to flare, you're going to make ground contact before you're able to burn off all that energy. And what will happen is because your center of gravity is back here behind your pivot, the tail is going to get pulled down because gravity is going to pull that down. So if you make ground contact prematurely, before we've had enough time to burn off all our speed, main wheels make ground contact, tail drops, angle of attack increases, excess speed turns a lift, plane jumps right back in the air. Looks like a bounce, but it's more balloon than bounce. See that? If I break my glide too high above the runway, airplane begins to sink, I start to work my flare, I end up losing speed prematurely, and the airplane will stall and then drop onto the ground. So the glide brake is a little bit more critical than it would be, say, in a tri-gear. The tri-gear is going to be a little more forgiving of that. We have another board here which will illustrate that. Okay, if you take a look at this, here's our pivot point, here's our center of gravity. And you can see that the center of gravity in a tri-gear is ahead of its pivot point. In a tri-gear airplane, as long as you flare enough to cushion the touchdown, and you're not so fast that the increase in the angle of attack here at the point of ground contact is going to make the airplane fly again, the airplane will have a tendency to stay on the ground because your center of gravity is ahead of the pivot. When it makes ground contact, that downward pull is going to pull the nose down and decrease the angle of attack, so the airplane will have a tendency to stay on the ground. If we do the same thing in a tailwheel airplane, let's say we tried to flare it like we would in a tri-gear, where you just kind of flare enough to cushion without the full stall. Our main wheels make ground contact first. The downward pull is going to pull the tail down. That gravity is going to help pull that tail down and increase the angle of attack. Any excess speed you have is going to turn into lift, and the airplane is going to balloon back in the air. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, great. We'll get back to this board. So the level off is fairly critical. So we need to be able to make that transition from the approach to the level off accurately. And sometimes what I like to do is just envision a person standing on the runway, and I want to try to level off, so I'm going to be that height, fuselage height. And sometimes it's a little bit easier for me to think of it in those terms because I'm actually in the fuselage, and I don't have to think about the gear hang so much. Just kind of think about the height of a person with reference to the fuselage. And that'll put your gear about 3 feet or so off the ground, which is a pretty good place for that to be. So we need to be able to judge that height accurately. And that's an area where most people have a little bit of trouble. And part of that has to do with fixating on the end of the runway. You're coming in for a landing, you're focusing on the approach end of the runway, and this is what you're using to judge that glide path. The same thing here, right? So you're really focused on the approach end of the runway. The problem is, as you get closer to the runway, you need to stop looking there because this is just what you're using to gauge your glide path. This is not where the airplane is going to land. This is kind of your aim point for your glide path. And if you look here too long, you're actually probably end up leveling off too low to the ground. In other words, if you just focus on the approach end of the runway, you're just going to drive it into the ground. So once you get on shore final, stop looking here. Okay, you're not going to look at the approach end of the runway anymore. This bad. Stop looking here, start looking downrange. So you're actually, even though the nose is going downhill, you're actually going to lift your head and look downrange and include the runway edges here and here. So you'll actually be kind of looking out on almost a V like this. And the reason you want to do that is that in some airplanes you might start losing sight of that center line as you progress into the flare. The other reason for that is when you start looking offset the runway, you're going to gain better height reference because instead of looking at a blank sheet of paper at a runway, you start looking offset the runway, you're going to start seeing things that are also out there in the periphery, buildings, parked airplanes, grass, runway lights. All those things go into the mix to help you judge your height. If you're just staring at the runway, sometimes, especially a wide one, it looks like a blank sheet of paper and it becomes more difficult to judge the height. So the further away you look, the slower things happen, including the runway edges, will give you better height reference so that we can get the glide brake correct. If we do this part right, then the flare is relatively easy. Okay, let's take the model for a second. If we're coming in for a landing, and this pencil represents where I'm looking, as I come into the end of the runway, if I'm just keep looking at the approach end of the runway, I'm going to drive it right into the ground. So when I get on shore final, I'm actually going to look up first and start including the runway edges, so that now I'll have an idea where parallel is and also have an idea where the height is. So I'll be bringing the airplane into my field of view rather than getting to a point and then using the airplane to change my field of view. Then I could just kind of ease into that level off. So around 10 feet, I'm going to start shallowing out so I can be done or be level, height of a person, or around 6 feet. And that part's important because if I just ride this down to 6 feet, what are the chances that I could just snap it level without a balloon on the backside? Okay? What you need to do is ease into this. So I start incrementally changing the angle of attack so I can be done by the height of a person, or 6 feet. That's going to put my gear about 3 feet off the ground. Now the airplane's paralleling the runway as it burns off speed. As it sheds speed, it's going to begin to sink. That's what you're looking for, the onset of the sink. And that'll all be predicated by your forward speed. If I'm slow, as I start to shallow out, it may start sinking immediately. Or if I'm fast, it may have to parallel the runway before it burns enough speed to start to sink. As the airplane begins to sink, that's my signal, the onset of the sink, to start working in my backstick for my flare. So as the airplane begins to sink, just like you were taught in your primary training, try not to let it land. Keep it flying, keep it flying, keep it flying, keep it flying until it stalls on ground contact. One way that you can look at this too is pretend that the main wheels don't exist. Pretend the only wheel is the tail wheel. So as the airplane's sinking, you're keeping it flying, in your mind's eye, try to land it slightly on the tail first. 9 times out of 10, it won't hit tail first, it'll hit 3-point. So in your mind's eye, just try to land tail first, and it'll make ground contact. If it does hit tail first, well, okay, what happens? Now, my pivot point's back here, my center of gravity is ahead of the pivot. So the gravity will help pull the nose down and actually decrease the angle of attack. Better to come in, kerplop, like this, than it is to hit mains first and then have it jump back in the air. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
The only thing you have to be careful of with the tail first landing is when you fly airplanes that have a flat deck angle on the ground. If you looked at an Aranca Champ or a Citabria, they sit at a relatively flat deck angle, and those airplanes will actually land without having to full stall them. So you could hit potentially tail first quite a bit on those. But if you have an airplane that sits at a very high deck angle, like the Stearman, the Cubs, those airplanes, if you try to land them tail first, will generally hit 3-point. Okay, and by high deck angle, I mean the angle that it sits at on the ground. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Last thing is the changing sight picture. Once we level off, depending on the airplane that you're flying, you may be able to see over the nose just fine during that flare portion. But in some airplanes, particularly if they have blind spots, as the airplane begins to settle and you start working in the flare, you may have to change where you're looking. In other words, you may not be able to look straight over the nose. That's why I like to include the runway edges, so that as the flare progresses, we lose sight of the center line or lose sight of the center of the runway. If we're looking at the runway edges, we'll still know where the ground is. We'll still have a reference for whether the airplane's straight, and we can keep timing our flare that way. If you continue to look over the nose, everything over the nose goes away, your head will cock back, and you may end up over-flaring the airplane because your hand will follow your head. So you might have to have a changing sight picture. It's easy enough to determine that. Just sit in the airplane when it's in the landing attitude on the ground and ask yourself one question: where can I see a few hundred feet ahead of the airplane? If the answer is not straight over the nose, then you need to find a spot that you can look. In the airplane that we're flying, you're going to start to lose the visibility over the nose. Okay, in this frame here, you can see the center line pretty well, but as the flare progresses, this goes away. So you need to stop looking there. Start looking at the runway edges. And in this shot here, it's going to be roughly 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. So you're going to be looking pretty much here and here to pick up those runway edges, because that's all you're going to get as far as knowing that the airplane is straight, centered, and you'll have a height reference that way so you can time your flare. So the changing sight picture is a very important thing, and we'll reiterate this during the training. So why don't we go ahead and try it?
All right.
Okay, Jill, now that the ground school's finished, we're going to go out and do some takeoffs and landings, 3-point, 2 different styles of takeoffs, and for that we're going to use the Cubcrafter Sport Cub. So why don't you go ahead and saddle up and we'll get going.
Okay.
Aeroflex Sport Cub departing on 2-1, close pattern. As you taxi into position, look for the runway edges. That's how you're going to determine your lineup. You have equal distance between the edges. Taxi forward just a little bit, make sure your tail wheel's straight. All right, now we got 2 ways to go here. In calm conditions, we're going to relax the stick and just let the tail fly itself up. This way you can focus on your directional control, which is going to be the most important thing at this phase of your training. So we're going to go 5 count on the throttle, nice and smooth. Then simply relax the stick and let the tail fly itself up. It'll go wherever your trim is set. So if your trim's set for neutral, the tail will come up to level. Focus on the rudder control and directional control.
Okay.
Okay, once we get airborne, climb at 60. Okay, ready?
Ready.
5 count on the throttle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Relax the stick. Focus on the rudder. Be patient. Let the tail fly itself up. All right, now ease back on the stick, nice and easy. Good. back to about 2,200 RPM for downwind. Even the numbers, power comes back to 1,500 RPM. Go ahead and put your first notch of flap in. Well, check the balloon when you bring the flaps in. It's going to want to pitch up on.
Uh-huh.
All right, let's make our base leg. Bring your second notch of flap in. Roll out of your turn, throttle back, throttle back. Keep yourself lined up. Rudder keeps the nose straight. Aileron controls the drift. Relax. Put your forearm on your thigh, on your right leg, so you can steady the stick a little bit. All right, now get your head outside, start looking downrange, throttle back. At about 8 feet, begin a shallowing process. Height of a person, you want to be level. Now you're going to keep it flying, keep it flying, keep it flying, keep it flying. All right, that was a drop in. Okay, what happened was you leveled off a little bit too high. Stay on the rudders, focus on your directional control. Okay, your approach was looking pretty good. The problem spot there was, or the trouble spot I should say, was that you leveled off a little bit too high. So what happened is the plane started losing speed, it started to sink, you started to flare, but pretty much you ended up landing about 3 or 4 feet in the air and it just dropped on. We just ran out of stick. So to correct that, you need to correct the level off. Level off needs to be a little bit lower to the ground. Looking for about height of a person. So you can start shallowing out around 8 feet and finish off around 6 feet, fuselage height. That'll put your gear about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. Then as the plane starts to sink, just start working in the backstick. Just keep it flying, keep it flying, keep it flying. Looking 10 and 2 at the edges of the runway. That helps you determine your height, but also that you're centered and straight. In your mind's eye, just try to land on the tail first. Just at the very end of that, pretend the tail wheel's the only wheel. Try to land on that tail first, and that'll give you a nice 3-point touchdown.
Okay.
That makes sense?
That makes sense.
Okay, Jill. This time on our takeoff, we're going to use a slightly different technique. Rather than letting the tail fly itself up, what you're going to do is taxi position, make sure your tail wheel's straight. Start with the stick back, 5 count on the throttle. So that part of it's exactly the same as what we were doing before. Relax the stick, just like we did before. The difference is, as you feel the tail starting to lighten up, you'll start to feel it wanting to leave the ground. And at one point, you're going to feel like, if I just push the stick forward another quarter throw, the tail will come up. That's the ideal time to raise the tail. You don't want to jam the stick forward or raise it too quickly, because in addition to the left turning tendencies that we already know about, you could induce some gyroscopic force from the propeller, which can be significant, especially in some airplanes.
Okay.
Okay, you ready? We're going to start with our stick back, our tail wheel straight. And here we go. 5 count on the throttle, focus on the rudder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Rudders, relax the stick. As you feel the tail starting to get light, ease the stick forward. That's it. Now ease it off the ground. The plane knows how to fly, it just needs help staying straight. Now, as you can see, there's a changing sight picture on this airplane. As you level off and the airplane begins to sink and you start working your flare, you can see that you start losing visibility straight over the nose. You really can't see the runway. So as that nose comes up and it starts to block the end of the runway, don't try to look straight over the nose, look at the runway. In this airplane, you're going to be looking more like 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock.
Okay.
And you'll see the runway askew the nose. And that's why it's so important to use the runway edges and not get focused on the center line. Now, even though we're going downhill right now, you want to start looking downrange so you can start judging your height. I'm looking for 8 feet to begin shallowing. Height of a person, you want to be level. Look 10 and 2. Little low on the level off. Mains first. Okay, although that landing felt pretty good, it was definitely on the main wheels first. You can feel it almost took a little bit of a hop there.
Yeah,
So that time to level off was a little bit too low.
I felt that.
Easy on those brakes. The brakes grab, you can feel the tail come up a little bit there. Are you having trouble trying to figure out your height above the runway? When you're on short final, you need to look offset the runway. So you're looking at the runway edges, but also look at the runway environment. There's trees out there, there's buildings, there's parked airplanes, there's the runway lights, there's grass. So when you're looking downrange on short final and you're looking at the edges of the runway, you're trying to also determine your height. So you can guesstimate where you're at 8 feet and then again at 6 feet. And that doesn't have to be 100% exact. If you're within a little bit of being correct, it'll make a pretty good landing for you. But the level off is really critical.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to try that again. All right, here we go. 1, 2, rudders. 3, 4, 5. Relax the stick. As you feel the tail getting light, right there, get behind it. Help the tail up, nice and easy, good. And off we go. All right, good takeoff. As you start that turn to final, kind of lean forward a little bit, take a look. And that'll help you see the runway a little better, and you can adjust your turn while you're in it.
Okay.
So start your turn, now lean forward a little bit, take a look at the runway. Okay, that was the right move. Now get your head outside, looking for height of a person to be level. You can lead it a little bit. Look 10 and 2, keep the plane straight, look at the edges. 10 and 2, keep it flying, land on the tail. Good, keep it straight, landing. Keep it straight. That's it.
Okay, Jill, that wasn't too bad for your first time. We didn't leave any airplane parts on the runway, so I think it wasn't too bad. A couple of mistakes you made that were typical. One was leveling off too high, breaking the glide too high. And usually what will happen is the airplane will just start to get too slow, and it starts to sink rapidly, and you're trying to catch it by bringing in that backstick, and you actually end up landing a few feet in the air. And the airplane stalls and drops onto the runway. And we actually went from one extreme to the other. The other landing, we leveled off too low. And many times that'll result in the main wheels obviously contacting the ground before you had time to spend all its energy. Main wheels hit first, our center of gravity is back behind the main wheels, behind our pivot point, tail drops, angle of attack increases, and the airplane takes that extra lift that you didn't burn off and turns it into a balloon, essentially. What we'll do is we'll go out, we'll take a break, and we'll go try a couple more and see if we can't fix the problems that were plaguing us earlier. Okay, Jill, you've been doing great with the three-point landing, so why don't we talk about the wheel landings a little bit? Okay. With the three-point landing, we kind of break our glide up here around height of a person, and then as the airplane starts to sink, we start to burn off our speed, and we actually get the airplane to stall just on ground contact. So we're making the airplane spend its energy just before it touches down or at ground contact. With the wheel landing, you're pretty much coming in, as the name suggests, on the main wheels, and you make your touchdown, and then you transition your stick forward, you go negative on the wing, and then you're spending your energy after the rollout, okay? You can do these with power or without power, and you can touch down in various attitudes. You could be either level at the touchdown, you can be slightly nose low at the touchdown, or slightly tail low at the touchdown, and then you transition your stick forward. The methods I prefer are either level or slightly tail low at the touchdown, okay? You can use power or not. I like to use power, come in at normal speeds, or slightly fast, depending on what the winds are doing. The reason for the power is twofold. One is the power helps to minimize the sink rate down to the runway. If we touch with too much vertical speed, just like on a three-pointer, if our main wheels make ground contact, the tail is going to drop, angle of attack increases, and the airplane is going to jump back up in the air. So by carrying some power, that helps minimize the sink down to the runway. The other thing the power does is it energizes our rudder and our elevator. So when we make ground contact, if we're having directional control issues, the throttle, that power, will help us regain control. Think of it as power steering for your rudders. So we come in, we level off close to the runway, within about a foot or two wheel height above the runway, with a little power, and be patient. And just kind of wait for the ground to fly to you. Just hold it there and wait. Airplane makes ground contact, stick comes forward. Bringing the stick forward puts a negative angle on the wing, and that's going to keep the airplane on the ground. Then, if we're under good directional control, we reduce our power. If we're not under good directional control, then don't take the power out. Don't be in a hurry. Always assess the situation. Touch down. If we're under good directional control, then you can reduce your power. Then as the airplane loses speed, the tail will start to come down and it'll drop. The other method is the tail low method. We level off This allows us to bring it in at a slower speed if we choose to. It's also better if the field's a little bit rougher. So if I want to land a little bit slower, the field's a little rough, I level off, same height, about a foot or so above the runway with a little bit of power. As the airplane begins to sink, I just start to backstick it a little bit, almost like I'm making a bad three-pointer, like you're landing at 150. Just backstick, main wheels touch, then your stick comes forward again. You rock it back up onto the main wheels, and you get a negative angle on the wing.
Okay.
Once the airplane starts to slow down, there's two things that you're going to notice. One is a rudder fade. And in a plane like the one that we're flying, the Cub, as the airplane starts to lose speed, right around 20 miles an hour or so, you're going to feel a pretty distinctive rudder fade. All of a sudden, the rudder's going to feel a little bit mushy. Right behind that, you're going to see a slight pitch change. When you see that pitch change, whatever forward pressure you're holding, just relax that pressure and let the tail come down. Once the tail makes ground contact, then keep the stick back. If you don't bring it back and the terrain's rough, it's going to start to crow hop on you. So you want to make sure that once it makes ground contact, that the stick is back. A lot of times people will wheel land, they bring the stick forward, and as the plane slows down, they continually push the stick forward to hold the tail up as long as possible. The reason for that is they don't want the tail to come down prematurely and then have the airplane get airborne. The only thing about that is I don't like to hang the tail up too long. So what I like to do is when I bring the stick forward, just kind of freeze it. Once you know it's going to be nailed on the ground, just freeze it, don't pull it or push it. Look for the rudder fade and then the slight pitch change. If I keep pushing the stick forward, I'm pushing the elevator against that pitching moment and I'll never see the pitch change. So just enough forward stick to keep it there, then look for the rudder fade, slight pitch change, release that forward pressure, tail comes down, then bring the stick back. Does that make sense to you?
Yep.
Okay. The advantages to the wheel landing are that we can come in at whatever speed we want. Our limiting factor is really the length of the runway. So I can come in at a faster than normal speed, which in certain wind conditions is going to give me the advantage of better controllability. The other advantage to the wheel landing is that I can see better. I can see over the nose. So once I make ground contact, I can see the whole time. And if I need to effect a go-around, it's a little bit easier from this attitude as well. So in certain wind conditions, you're not going to have the disadvantage that you might have with a three-point landing. When I come in with a three-pointer, as I start to flare, I'm very susceptible at this point because I have a high angle of attack. If I get hit with a bad gust, the airplane may just balloon back up in the air. With a wheel landing, I'm either coming in flat or just slightly tail low. And if it was real windy, I would probably just choose to come in flat. This way, I'm not going to have that angle of attack increase disadvantage. I would just kind of come in flat with a little bit of power, maybe some extra speed to help combat the wind. The airplane lands flat, and then I go negative. So I'm not likely to get gusted back in the air. So the advantage here would be in certain gusty wind conditions, the wheel landing is going to be a little bit easier to put on the ground. The disadvantage is that after we bring that stick forward and we start losing speed, there's going to be a gray area where we're waiting for this tail to transition down, okay? Depending on how slow the airplane will fly. And some of the lighter airplanes like Cubs, the tail will hang up there quite a bit. And some of the heavier airplanes, the tail transitions down a bit quicker. But on a plane like a Cub, that tail will hang up there for a long period of time. And it may be there at a speed below which you may not have enough rudder authority to offset a direct crosswind. So my opinion is that the wheel landing advantage is more for a gusty headwind to a quartering gusty headwind. But as the wind becomes more of a direct crosswind, especially in a light airplane, I think the advantage kind of diminishes with the wheel landing then. And you may have more of an advantage with the three-pointer because you can just kind of keep that wing down into the wind and get a three-point attitude with a two-point touchdown because you're really not worried about the plane getting gusted back in the air as much as you are, weathercocking and drifting. So that's something that will be a matter of opinion, but in my experience, I think that the advantage to the wheel landing is with a gusty headwind to a quartering gusty headwind. Do you have any questions on that?
No.
So why don't we saddle up the Top Cub and we'll head over to Trinka and we'll try some wheel landings.
Let's go.
Okay, we're going to do two different methods of wheel landings here. The first method, we're just going to put it on flat. Now, the flat method of the wheel landing I would probably use if it was very gusty out and I'm worried about the airplane possibly getting lifted back in the air by a rogue gust. And just like the three-pointer, the sight picture is very important on this. What you want to make sure that you're not doing is looking 5 feet off the nose of the airplane. It's very tempting. You want to make sure you look downrange, just kind of like we do in the three-pointer. This way you can judge your height and get the airplane to level off closer to the ground.
Okay.
If If you level off too high, it's just going to eat up more runway. The closer you can get your level off, the sooner it's going to make ground contact. And the idea here is to zero your sink rate out on ground contact. So in order to do that, you're going to fly level with just a little bit of power. You're a little high here, throttle back. Let's put a little slip in, drop your left wing, add some right rudder. If you can shallow your approach out, it's easier to pull off the wheel landing. Relax, relax. Look downrange, you're only trying to level about a foot above the ground. Look further away. A little bit of power. Now just wait, hold it there, let the ground fly to you. Wait, wait. Forward stick, a little more. More aggressive with the forward stick. All right, we kind of dropped it on. We could have used a little bit more power. Throttle back. There's your rudder fade. There's your pitch change, bring your stick back. The idea behind the throttle is to help minimize the sink rate. So you need to bring in enough power so that you're going to touch with a minimal sink rate. Or try to zero your sink rate out on ground contact, and then it won't bounce. But as soon as you feel the wheels make ground contact, you need to go forward on that stick. So you want to go forward of neutral. This way the airplane stays on the ground. If you can shallow your approach out, you're gonna have an easier time of making the wheel landing happen.
Yeah, I felt like it bounced in a little bit.
Yeah. You had a little too much vertical speed. Took a little hop, it wasn't terrible. If it takes just a little hop like that, you can just bring the stick forward and it'll usually just basically drive it right back onto the ground. If you bounce real bad, it takes a 3 or 4 or 5 foot hop in the air, then if you have enough runway in front of you, you can turn that into a 3-pointer easy enough, or go around. If you bounce real bad, just get out of there.
All right.
Okay, let's try it again. As you come in on short final, just think about incrementally changing your angle of attack so that you'll be finished or leveled off just above the runway. So you're still going to lead it just like you do on a 3-pointer, but the whole thing happens lower. Watch the far end of the runway, don't look right off the nose here. Now carry a little bit of power, let the ground fly to you, be patient. Just wait, when you feel it make ground contact, push the stick forward. All right, that wasn't too bad. Now throttle back. Now look for the rudder to fade. Here's your pitch change, now let the tail come down.
That felt better.
Yep.
I think the last time I was looking over the nose, I wasn't looking down the runway enough.
If you look too close, you're going to drive it into the ground.
Yeah.
You don't want to be looking too close to the airplane. Now, after we make ground contact and you bring your stick forward, you don't have to be in a huge hurry to reduce the power, especially if it's a gusty day. Always make sure you're under good directional control and then throttle back, because that extra power on the touchdown is energizing that rudder, and if you're having a difficult time with directional control, then you want to have that power in there because that's going to help give you extra rudder authority.
Right.
Also, if you make that touchdown and it feels a little swervy, you may decide that you're going to go around because you just don't like what's happening, so having that extra power in there makes the go around a little bit easier as well. All right, let's try another one, and then we'll try some tail lows. Decide you need to lose some altitude, you'll get a more efficient slip if you drop your wing first and then bring in the opposite rudder. Simply by dropping a wing, you're going to get some adverse yaw, which is going to pull the nose to the outside, which is exactly where you're going to go in the slip anyway. Now you're already in a left turn, you can see you're a little high, so just add some outside top rudder, there you go. So we're turning our left turn into a slip, easy enough to do. All right, come out of that. Get your head looking downrange, incrementally level off, and just kind of hold it, wait. Good, forward stick it. All right, throttle back, look for the rudder fade, right there, there's your pitch change, bring your stick back.
That one felt pretty good.
Yeah, wasn't bad. Okay, this time we're going to try the tail low method. And what you're going to do is come in, pretty much the same approach, and pretty close to the same level off. The difference is that before you touch, rather than using lots of power, you're going to use a little backstick to cushion the touchdown to zero out the sink rate. So before you touch, you can actually start to flare the airplane, start coming back on the stick. So your stick will be aft of neutral on the touchdown, and then after you touch, you'll actually transition it forward of neutral. So we'll carry some power, but we'll come in at a somewhat slower speed, probably around a normal speed, let's say 60, 65. And same level off, about a foot above, but as the airplane starts to sink, just come in with a little backstick. All right, so let's try that.
Okay.
So the tail low method I would use if the terrain was a bit rougher, or I'm looking to land a little bit shorter and still do a wheel landing. If it were super gusty out, then I'd probably stick with a flat wheel landing. Eventually what you want to do is be able to mix and match elements of each technique. In other words, come in with power like you do on the flat ones, but don't be afraid at the same time to use a little backstick to help as a cushion. So I'm going to teach you two different methods, and then eventually you'll meld the two techniques together and just use elements of each at the appropriate time. So if you feel like the plane is sinking out from under you a little bit too fast, you know, if it's a gusty day, you won't be afraid to sneak a little backstick in so you don't hit hard. Does that all make sense?
Yes.
So again, basically the same approach. You're going to shallow out if you can. A little bit of power, but don't allow your speed to build too much. You know, bring it in at kind of a normal speed, 60, 65. And same level off, you want to shallow out your approach incrementally, end up level about a foot or less above the ground. And then as the airplane sinks to the ground, just start to flare it like you're in a Skyhawk. Just pretend you're just trying to flare the cushion. And as soon as you feel the main wheels touch, it'll go forward to neutral. So you'll be slightly tail low at the touch, and then rocket up onto the mains. And take a little power out, you can adjust your glide path just by playing with that power there. And let it come on down, you can always put the power in later. Now bring a little power back in. That's enough. Now just pretend you're landing a Skyhawk. Kiss it on with backstick. Backstick it, forward stick. A little more aggressive. Don't be afraid to push the stick forward. Now throttle back, look for your rudder fade. There's your pitch change, bring your stick all the way back. Good. Touchdown was real nice. You have to be a little bit quicker to get that stick forward. When you touch tail low, if you wait there too long, the airplane can have a tendency to get airborne again because you have a positive angle of attack. So you have to transition that stick forward fairly quickly after the touchdown. Don't be afraid to tag the prop. You can go full forward stick, you're still not going to hit the prop. So, don't be afraid to bring that stick forward.
I know, that's always in the back of my mind.
You'd have to really hit hard and splay the gear in this plane to hit the prop. If you hit the brakes, it'll hit the prop. But
Right.
you're not going to do it on a normal wheel landing.
Okay.
You're moving forward, and there's so much airflow hitting your horizontal stabilizer that it actually wants to push the tail down. All right, we're going to try that again, another tail low method. The tail low method, you could actually do power off if you want to. You don't even have to use power. You can go power off just like you do on a 3-point landing, and just use enough backstick to really zero the sink rate out, and an awful lot of forward stick to transition it up, but it can be done. I prefer to do it kind of a combination technique where you're using a little bit of power and just a little backstick just before you touch, and you'll roll them on real nice. Just a little bit of power. Flare it like you're in the Skyhawk. Kiss it on with backstick, forward stick, a little more. All right, you're under good directional control. There's your rudder fade. Good. The downside of the wheel landing is you have that gray area where you're waiting for that tail to transition down.
Right.
You're starting to lose rudder authority, you're losing directional control somewhat, and if you're in a direct crosswind, the airplane's going to start to weather vane on you, and if there's not enough rudder there, it's going to start to turn into the wind, and now you have to start getting fancy with your brakes, and that can lead to problems. So I'm not a real fan of hanging the tail up too long.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Let's taxi out. Now you can kill your power here, and then when you get lower, put it back in.
Uh-huh.
Now put a little power back in, see? Eyes downrange, about a foot above. Layer it like you're putting the Skyhawk on. Back, forward stick it. Now you're under good directional control, power comes off. Look for the rudder fade, there's your pitch change, stick comes back, good.
It felt good.
You see how we kind of manipulated the approach there a little bit?
Yes.
In other words, you don't have to be on mid-final or long final and then start adding power, because then you're going to start building all kinds of speed. You can actually throttle back, let it drop in over the runway and just put power in just as you're leveling off. So the power can come in wherever you want it to. You can put it in just over the runway, or you can put it out there on final, depending on the conditions or how your approach is going.
Uh-huh.
The idea is to minimize your sink at the touchdown. So the power, as long as the power is in before you touch at some point, it's enough to arrest the sink rate, and or using a combination of power and backstick, you can roll the wheels right on, and you can see you can make it touch wherever you want.
All right, Jill, that was great. For your first time, you did real well with those. You avoided some of the common pitfalls that most people run into, which are leveling off too high and then eating up way too much runway, or dropping it in. In other words, having too much vertical sink and then that resulting in a balloon or a bounce. Mm-hmm. You really didn't have those issues. Your level offs were all pretty decent. You had about the right height, about a foot above the runway. And you can see the two different styles, using a little power and keeping it flat and just kind of letting the runway fly to you. Or the other style is using a little backstick, tail low method, just before you touch, and using the backstick then to make a cushion rather than just the power. But you did pretty well with those. You can see the tail low method will usually result in a little softer touchdown, especially if the terrain's a little bit rough. Mm-hmm. Or if you're going to land a little bit shorter, you can afford to slow your speed down a little bit more, carry some power. You'll already be a little bit nose high, and you can get a little shorter and softer touchdown with the tail low method than if you're just kind of driving it on flat. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to put it on flat, it's usually going to be because there's a pretty gusty situation, and I don't want to be with too much angle of attack on the touchdown, because then you run the risk of getting gusted back in the air. I feel pretty good with the way you were putting the wheel landings on, so I think we're ready to get challenged a little bit with some crosswind. So next week when we meet, we'll look for a crosswind day, and if we get some good winds, then we'll get a good workout with some crosswind wheel landings and crosswind three-pointers.
All right, great.
Okay, looks like I'm going to be flying solo today, and we've got a pretty good wind blowing here, so when we taxi, we're going to make sure that we hold the controls correctly. And we have a left quartering tailwind, so our stick's going to be forward and to the right. We're going to dive away from the wind. What we're going to do on the takeoff roll is we're going to start with our stick full back. The ailerons are going to be into the wind. And we're going to go to full power. And we're just going to relax our stick. Tail starts getting light, we're just going to help it up a little bit so that we're not lingering in three-point attitude too long. This way if we get hit by a road gust, we don't get lifted in the air prematurely on the takeoff roll. And we're going to give it a little extra forward stick so we go negative on the wing. The negative angle is going to keep us on the ground longer so that we can build extra speed for the wind shear. Also, it's going to add some extra friction on the main wheels, which will help cut down on some of the drifting. The aileron will help cut down on the drifting, plus you're going to get some adverse yaw from the ailerons, which will help stop some of the weather veining. You're probably still going to need some rudder if the wind is real strong to keep the airplane from turning into the wind or from weathercocking too much. Alright, so here we go. Ailerons into the wind, sticks back, coming up on the throttle. Okay, right up to full power, relax the stick, ailerons full deflection, a little extra forward stick. Take some of that aileron out. We're a little nose low and a little bit on one wheel. And we're going to rotate. We'll level our wing, crab into the wind. Okay, you can see that's a pretty good crab angle. The wind's pretty strong up here. Okay, we're going to make our crosswind turn. That wind's getting behind me. Instead of squaring off my turn, I may just keep that bank angle in there so I can roll out on that downwind line that I'm looking for. And now I'm going to crab into the wind on downwind. Okay, I'm going to beam the numbers. Power's coming back. About 1,500 RPM. I'm going to go for a notch of flap. This particular particular airplane, whether I'm wheel landing or three-pointing, even if it's windy, I like to use full flaps. The reason I use a full flap is so that although I'm going to come in a little faster, I'm going to increase my speed by half the gust factor. The full flap will cut down on the ballooning and the floating, especially if it's a shorter strip. Also, I can touch down at a slower speed. If you touch down at too high of a speed, any swerve you get is going to be accentuated. So swerves are a little bit easier to manage if you land at a slower speed. So I kind of juggle between, increasing my speed enough to allow for what the situation dictates, but not be so fast that if I have directional control issues, I'm going to have my hands full. If I was an underpowered airplane, then I would probably limit my flaps, especially if I was worried about wind shear. Okay, I'm going to delay that turn to final a little bit, initiate that turn a little bit later. When I roll out on final, I'm going to leave a little crab in. When I get on short final, we're going to go to wing low. Going to try to keep landing flat, a little bit of power, there's some ballooning. Just going to be patient with it, let the ground fly to me. Keep that wing down. There's our touchdown. The aileron into the wind. More aileron as I slow down. And now the stick's coming back. You don't want to bring that tail down too soon on a gusty day, because it might get gusted back up in the air. But you also don't want to hang it up there longer than you need to. So after I touch down, I bring my stick forward. Enough so I know that it's negative on the wing. But instead of continually pushing it forward, I'm just going to kind of freeze it where it is, just enough so I know it's going to hold me on the ground. I'm going to look for the rudder fade and a slight pitch change. When I see that pitch change, it's telling me that the tail's pretty much done. If the tail's already done, then the wings are done. So at that point, I'm not going to wing the stick back and drop the tail on the ground, but what I'll do is I'll positively release a forward pressure. Kind of let that tail come down nice and easy. Once the tail makes ground contact, then I'll bring my stick back. Okay, I'm going to taxi into position. Looking for the edges of the runway to help my lineup. If the wind was really nasty, instead of lining up in the center of the runway, especially if it's a nice wide runway like this one, I'll line up on the windward side a bit, so that during the takeoff roll, if I do start drifting, it's going to drift me towards the center. And most of the time in this machine, I'll get airborne before I get beyond that. All right, here we go. Stick is back. Ailerons into the wind. Starting to gain speed. I'm going to help that tail up a little bit. A little extra forward stick. Go negative on the wing. That's it. We rotate, level the wing, and crab. I'm looking at that runway, extending that center line out here. I'm going to initiate my turn a little bit later so I can get a good intercept on it. And when I turn final, I'm going to crab into the wind. When I get on short final, if there's some shear, any wind shear, I'm going to deal with power. Okay, I'm going to come out of my crab, go to the wing low. This will give us a zero drift at touchdown. I'm going to try to keep the wheel landing a little flatter. Touch on the windward wheel first. Keep that aileron into the wind. That's it. As the airplane decelerates, I'm going to put more and more aileron into the wind. And now my stick's back all the way.
Okay, Jill, we have a cold front coming through today, and that's brewing up a nice little crosswind for us. So it's actually a good day to practice some crosswind three-point landings. The only extra thing you're going to have to worry about today is that we are having some shear out there. So you're likely to get gusted back in the air when you go into that three-point attitude. And if you do, then we're just going to use a little power to make the recovery. So if it gets gusted back up, just kind of relax the stick, and on the downside of that, bring in a little bit of power. Think of the throttle as extra elevator for you. And if you feel like you're running out of stick, think of the throttle as that extra elevator. Don't treat it as something foreign. Treat the throttle like it's an extra control surface. And when you need that power, use it. In a day like today, you'll have to be on it, fairly quickly. We're going to add power smoothly like we normally do. When the tail comes up to level, give it some extra forward stick so you can go negative on that wing. And the reason for the negative angle of attack on the wing is that that'll stop us from getting airborne too soon. If we get hit with a bad gust, it won't lift us into the air prematurely. Also, that negative angle will allow us to build speed, so we can actually hold it on the ground longer than we normally would, build up some extra speed, climb out at a flatter angle with the extra speed in case we get some wind shear after liftoff. As far as the ailerons go, start out with full aileron deflection into the wind. As the airplane gains speed, you can feel the ailerons coming to life. Right around the time that tail comes up, the ailerons will be coming to life. You'll start taking some of that aileron out. If the wind is strong enough, leave some of the aileron in there, and you'll actually be bouncing on one wheel just before you rotate. If the crosswind's not that strong, then your ailerons may go to neutral just before you rotate. Either way, once you're airborne, level your wing and then crab into the wind.
Okay.
When you roll out on final, don't try to roll right out on the center line. Leave a little crab angle in there. And you can crab into the wind on final, and that'll feel fairly comfortable for you. But we can't land in the crab. So once you get on short final, you need to come out of the crab and go to a wing low. Okay, we're going to use the aileron to cancel out the drift, and you're going to be using your rudders to keep the airplane straight, so you may be cross-controlling to some extent. The touchdown is going to be a 3-point attitude, but it'll actually be a 2-point touchdown, meaning that you're going to touch windward wheel and tail wheel about the same time, but in a 3-point attitude. So it's going to feel a little odd to you because your nose is going to be coming up, and you'll actually be in somewhat of a bank at the touchdown, but you need to cancel out that drift at the touchdown. In this particular airplane, on the final approach, we're going to be using full flaps. This airplane with the full flaps, you actually get a little bit better aileron authority. And I'm not overly concerned about the wind shear because of the power to weight. We can climb out of most of it. What we're going to do is after we make ground contact, we're going to try to get the flaps out as soon as possible. And it is a bit of a distraction, and it's a skill that has to be learned. But there are some distinct advantages to retracting flaps in a tailwheel airplane after touchdown. Number one, you're going to increase your rudder authority because when the flaps are down, you're blanketing the top part of your rudder. Number two, and probably more importantly, it increases the stall speed of the airplane. And remember, we're touching down 3-point, high angle of attack. We get hit with a bad gust, especially with the flaps. We have vortex generators. The airplane's likely to get airborne without too much difficulty. So we want to ensure that it kind of stays on the ground. So we're going to retract the flap to help keep it there. And number three, getting the flaps out will cut down on the weather cocking. And really the only time you have to worry about the weather cocking is after you make ground contact. All right, ready to try it?
I'm ready to go.
Okay, let's start it up.
All right, Jill, let's pay attention to what the windsock's doing there. We basically have a quartering wind from behind us, so it's from our left. So we're going to dive away from the wind. Stick should be forward and to the right. There's always exceptions to that. Sometimes the winds will swirl around, it gets kind of gusty, so you just always have to be ready to kind of switch up those controls if you feel the inherent wind getting underneath the wing. Stick back, aileron full deflection. Okay, ready, here we go. Nice and smooth on the throttle. Relax the stick. Now help the tail up, push the stick forward. Little extra, there you go. Bounce it on that right wheel, a little more aileron. Stay with it, all right? Lift it off the ground. You gotta use the rudder to keep the nose straight. All right, let's climb. You see how it started turning into the wind on you?
Yeah.
Okay, the forward stick will help the weather, the drifting, but it's not gonna do anything about the weather cocking. All right, let's start our turn. Let's get our second notch of flap in there, leave a little crab into the wind. All right, just crab into the wind. Crab to the right. There you go. All right, start throttling back. Come out of your crab, go to your wing low. Feel the airplane, rear level off. Look 10 and 2, keep it flying, keep that wing down. Keep it flying, keep it flying, keep the wing down. Keep that stick back, get the flaps out of there. Oop, too late. All right, go around, lower your nose. One notch of flap out. Turn the carburetor heat off. Gotta remember to turn that off. That takes a lot of RPM away. Today's not a carburetor ice day. Yeah, we got gusted back in the air.
Yeah.
That's why on touchdown I like to get that flap out of there. That's kind of the downside to the 3-pointer. If it's a real gusty day, the wind can get it and really hit you. And if you get a bad gust with that high angle of attack, it can jump back up in the air. All right, looked like you were making a pretty good touchdown there. but you need to be a little faster getting that flap out after you touch. As you turn into the wind here, you can feel your ground speed slow down. Now while you're here, just kind of visualize that line, extend it out, and you can see your line, how you're going to intercept it from here. It also helps you determine if you're high or low. A day like today too, give yourself a little bit of a airspeed window to play in, because in rough air that needle's all over the gauge. So fly your pitch attitudes a bit and allow that needle to bounce. Go to your wing low, rudder keeps the nose straight. Now feel it. That's it. Look for your level off. Work it, keep it flying. Windward wheel, get the flaps out. Stay on the rudders now. Focus on keeping the plane straight. At that time you can see we made ground contact, the flaps came out and stayed on the ground.
Yeah. A lot of work.
I never said it was easy. You see what I mean about flying pitch attitudes?
Yeah.
Rather than chasing a gauge. If you're chasing a particular number, then you're going to be all over the sky trying to airspeed's always behind the airplane. You have to remember that. It's telling you history. Are you ready with some power here? Turn that carb heat off. The wind pulsates, so your input should do the same thing. Look for your level off. Look at 10 and 2 now. Milk off the speed. Keep it flying. Come on, back. Keep it flying. Keep it flying. Keep the wing down. Keep it flying. Keep it flying. Get the flaps out. Get them out. Good. Stay on the rudders. All right, that was pretty good.
That one felt pretty good.
That was a 3-point attitude, but a 2-point touchdown. Windward wheel and tail wheel at the same time.
All right, Jill, so does that convince you don't want to fly in heavy wind?
Yeah.
Actually, you did real well. You know, pretty gusty conditions, and the wind's kind of switching around and getting behind us and some shear, and so that makes it a much heavier workload. Yeah. All in all, you did fine with it. There was a few times where we had a little excess speed, and you can see that just translates into ballooning a lot of times. So when you get over that runway, you really need to burn off that speed. So just kind of, you know, hang it there as long as you can and just make it, you know, try not to let it land. Just milk off all that speed. And then, you know, keep that wing down a little bit on the touchdown if you feel it drifting. There was a few times where we had too much aileron, and it actually started drifting towards your correction into the wind. And, you know, so when you have that wing down, you know, sort of sense that drift when you're over the runway. If it's heading towards your correction, then you have more aileron than you need. You know, like I said before, the wind is very rarely constant. It usually pulsates, so your input should kind of go that way too. Just, you know, try to find a mid-range of aileron so you're not going to full aileron and then full out. You know, just, you know, put some in, see if that does a trick for you, and just kind of work a mid-range in there. Put it in, take it out, you know, put it in, take it out. And use whatever rudder it takes to keep the airplane straight. So just use the aileron to cancel out the drift, use the rudder to keep the plane straight. And right down to the touchdown. The retracting the flap deal, you know, you don't have to do that, but it does help keep the airplane on the ground. It is a very advanced technique, so I don't advocate doing that for a novice. But in this case, we did it. It does take a lot of practice, and it's not something you should do if you're not really experienced with it. But all in all, I thought you did fine with it. You have any questions?
On a day like today, would it be better to do wheel landings?
In my opinion, if you have kind of a gusty headwind to a gusty quartering wind, the wheel landing will have some advantages over the three-pointer because in the wheel landing you're coming in kind of flat and you're not as likely to get gusted back up in the air again. With the three-pointers, you increase that angle of attack, you're pretty susceptible to getting a pretty heavy gust there that'll lift you right back in the air again. Not that you can't three-point it, you can, but the workload will be fairly heavy. As you can see, we're working pretty hard to get these touchdowns. If the wind is kind of a steady crosswind or you know, not as gusty, then there's nothing wrong with doing a three-point landing in a crosswind because you're not really worried about the airplane getting gusted back in the air so much. You're not worried about that gust factor.
Let me ask you another question.
Sure.
If I were to do a wheel landing on a day like today, would I also retract the flaps as soon as I touch down, or would I leave them in?
Okay, that's a good question. The wheel landing, you're touching down at a flatter attitude and a higher speed, so getting the flaps out right away isn't going to be as advantageous. You're not really worried about the airplane jumping back up in the air at the point of ground contact. However, if you do retract the flaps during the wheel landing, that does allow you to get the tail down a little bit sooner. The wheel landing, as we already know, there's a gray area when you're waiting for that tail to transition down, and you're losing rudder authority, and that's where, if you do have a pure crosswind, the airplane may have a tendency to weather vane or weathercock into the wind. So that is kind of the disadvantage of the wheel landing, is that you still have to transition that tail down, and you might not have sufficient rudder authority when that's happening. So there are times when retracting the flaps on the wheel landing will allow you to get the tail down sooner. But again, and I'll just reiterate this again, it's a distraction, and you really have to be trained to do that. So that's not something you want to do as a novice. Wheel land and start, there's a lot going on there, moving the stick forward and trying to retract flaps. But once you gain some experience, you absolutely can. You can retract those flaps and have the tail come down a bit quicker, and therefore you'll have a little bit more rudder authority during the rollout. So that kind of helps you with that gray area, the transition of the tail. Does that all make sense to you? At this stage of the game, you're better off leaving the flaps alone, whether it's a three-pointer or a wheel landing, and not allow yourself to become distracted. And I kind of showed you that so that down the road, if you take some extra duel, you'll be aware of that technique. All right, Jill, you certainly earned your tailwheel endorsement. You did a great job. And this is just going to be the beginning for you. This opens up a whole new doorway. You'll be able to fly antique airplanes, aerobatics. It also opens up a lot of little grass strips that tricycle gear airplanes just don't go into. So hopefully this is just the beginning, and I hope you had a great time.
Damien, I had a wonderful time. I learned a lot, and I had so much fun doing it. And you are a wonderful instructor. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us for Tailwheel 101.